We had nothing left. Not a roof, not a dry blanket, not a plan. For 3 straight days, my little brother, our dog Max, and I had been moving from one broken shelter to another, trying to outrun a storm that refused to end. That night was the worst one yet. The wind cut sideways through the trees, and every stitch of clothing we owned was soaked to the skin. We weren't looking for anything special. We were just looking for a way to survive until morning. Then Max froze mid-step. He was staring at a gap in the rocks, half hidden under the roots of a tree so old it looked like it had been standing since before the mountain itself. From a distance it looked like nothing, just a shadow between 2 boulders. But when we squeezed through the opening and swept our flashlight across the darkness inside, none of us said a word. Because standing in front of us, deep inside that cave, was a cabin. A real one. Built from timber, still standing, still sealed off from the outside world, like someone had made it and then vanished without a trace. We had no idea who built it. We had no idea how long it had been sitting there untouched. But standing in that cave, listening to the storm scream outside the entrance, I understood something for the first time in days. We were finally safe. What we found inside that cabin didn't just get us through the night. It changed the direction of our lives. But before I tell you what was waiting inside, I want you to remember one thing as this story unfolds, because it's the whole reason I'm telling it. Shelter is never really about 4 walls. It's about what you choose to build once you have them. Keep that in mind, because it matters more than you think. None of us moved for a few seconds. My flashlight beam shook as it crossed the impossible shape in front of us. Not a pile of collapsed boards, not a ruined hunting shack. An actual cabin, sitting quietly under a stone ceiling, wrapped in roots from a tree that had somehow pushed its way down through cracks in the rock far above us. My brother grabbed the back of my jacket. "Is someone living here?" he whispered. I didn't answer, because honestly, I didn't know. Thunder rolled somewhere above the mountain, and the sound bounced through the cave like something exploding in the distance. Max walked slowly toward the cabin. His tail wasn't tucked between his legs. He wasn't growling. That told me more than any flashlight ever could. Animals pick up on danger long before people do, and for the first time in 3 days, he didn't look afraid of anything. The porch boards groaned under our weight as we stepped closer. Everything about this felt unreal, like we'd wandered straight into someone else's dream. The cabin looked old, genuinely old. But unlike everything else we'd stumbled across those last 3 days, it wasn't falling apart. The windows were caked in dust, the wood had faded to gray, yet it was still standing, still holding its shape, almost like it had been waiting for someone to show up. My brother glanced back toward the cave entrance, where rain was pouring through the gap like a waterfall. The storm wasn't letting up. We had exactly 2 options: turn around and spend another night freezing in the open, or open that door. I reached for the handle and hesitated for a moment before pushing it in. The hinges groaned, dust drifted through the beam of my flashlight, and the smell that hit us caught me off guard. Old wood, dried herbs, a faint trace of smoke from a fire that had gone out years ago. Not rot, not mold, something closer to home. Max walked in first, sniffed along the floorboards, crossed the room, and lay down beside an old stone fireplace like he'd already decided this place was safe. My brother looked at me the way he hadn't in days. Not fear, something closer to hope. That night we didn't explore a single extra room. We didn't go looking for answers about who built this place or why. We were too exhausted, too hungry, too worn down. We shut the door behind us and just listened. The storm kept raging somewhere on the other side of that rock wall, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to a different world entirely. For the first time in a long time, rain wasn't hitting our faces while we slept, and that alone felt like more than we deserved. I woke up to silence. For a second I forgot where we were. No rain, no thunder, just water dripping somewhere deep in the cave. My brother was still curled up under an old blanket we'd pulled from a wooden chest. Max lay by the fireplace, chest rising and falling slowly. All three of us had made it through an entire night without waking up shivering, and that alone told me how much things had already shifted. Then I remembered the next problem. Water. I reached for our bottle. A few drops left, nowhere near enough for three of us. Whatever relief I'd felt the night before disappeared almost instantly, because a roof over your head doesn't mean much if you can't keep your body running. I stepped out onto the porch. In daylight, the cave was massive, with thin threads of sunlight slipping through cracks somewhere far above, lighting parts of the stone in patches. That's when I noticed Max standing near the far wall, ears up, tail moving slowly, staring at something. I called his name. He barked once, then started walking. I followed, and a few seconds later my brother caught up with us. The deeper we went, the cooler the air turned and the smell changed too. Damp, fresh, alive in a way the rest of the cave wasn't. Then we heard it, a steady drip, drip, drip. A thin line of water was sliding down a crack in the rock face. Not much, just a ribbon of clear water running over stone. But to us, in that moment, it might as well have been a river. I knelt down and touched it. Cold, completely clean. My brother dropped down beside me. "You actually found it," he said to Max, who wagged his tail like he already knew how big a deal this was. For the next hour we filled everything we owned that could hold liquid. Bottles, old glass jars we found inside the cabin, even a rusted metal pot from what had probably been a kitchen once. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to drink, enough to cook with, enough to actually stay. Carrying the last container back, I stopped and looked around at everything. The cabin, the spring, the shelter from the storm. A day earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Now it felt like the start of something real. Whoever built that place hadn't just picked a spot at random. They'd built it right beside the one resource every person trying to survive needs before anything else. Water, and that's the first real lesson in all of this. The kind that applies whether you're stranded in a forest or just trying to get your life back on track after it falls apart. Figure out your non-negotiables first. Not your comfort. Not your plans. The basics that keep you alive long enough to build anything at all. Solving the water problem only exposed the next one. We had almost nothing to eat. That afternoon I went through every cabinet, every shelf, every drawer in that cabin, hoping for a forgotten sack of grain or dried food. Instead, I found dust, a few empty jars, and a cast iron pan hanging by the fireplace. Whoever had lived there before us had taken almost everything when they left. My brother sat at the table, quiet, his stomach growling loud enough that I could hear it from across the room. Mine wasn't doing much better. Without food, this cabin was just a comfortable place to slowly starve, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Max lifted his head, nose twitching, then walked toward the cave entrance. I followed. Outside, the storm had scrubbed the forest clean. Everything smelled like wet earth, pine, and moss-covered rock. We spent the next few hours searching carefully, because mistakes out there aren't small ones. Some berries were obviously safe, others weren't worth the risk. Some mushrooms looked edible, others looked like they'd put us in worse shape than we started in. I wasn't willing to gamble with my brother's life over a guess, and that's a rule worth carrying into ordinary life too. When you don't know something for certain, don't bet someone else's safety on your confidence. Max eventually stopped near a patch of blackberry bushes at the edge of a clearing, branches heavy with fruit, dark and untouched. My brother's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in days. We spent close to an hour filling every container we'd brought. Not a feast, but real food. On the walk back, we found something even better. A narrow stream running through the forest below the cave, water moving slow over smooth stones, and underneath the surface, fish, not many, but enough to matter. That evening I went back with a simple fishing line made from supplies I'd found inside the cabin. It wasn't elegant. Survival rarely is. It rewards persistence, not perfection. The first fish slipped the hook. So did the second. By sunset I was ready to give up, and then the line pulled tight and a flash of silver broke the surface. My heart nearly stopped. Actual dinner. Back at the cabin, my brother watched as I cooked it over the fire, the smell filling the room while Max stared at the pan hard enough to make us both laugh. One fish, a handful of berries, clean water. To most people that would look like almost nothing. To us, it felt like a full table. For the next stretch of days, we focused only on the fundamentals. Water, food, rest. Then, a new problem crept in slowly. Cold. The cave kept the rain and wind out, but every night the temperature dropped, and the stones seemed to pull warmth straight out of the air. One night my brother woke up shivering, with Max already pressed against him trying to share body heat. I fed another log into the fire and watched the flames struggle. We were running low on wood, and I decided to fix that before it turned into an emergency. The next morning, Max and I headed into the forest, collecting fallen branches and dead wood through air that smelled like pine and wet leaves. At first, I only gathered what I could carry in one trip. Then it hit me. If we planned to stay here for weeks, maybe months, one armful of sticks wasn't going to cut it. We needed a system, not a scramble. That afternoon, I built a small lean-to beside the cave entrance just to keep the firewood dry, nothing more than old boards and branches leaned together. When the next rain came through, the wood stayed dry, and that felt like a genuine win. Every day after that, I added another stack. My brother started counting them like they were treasure, and honestly, at that point they were. "Do you think we'll have enough for winter?" he asked one evening. Winter, I hadn't let myself think that far ahead yet, but he was right to ask, because somewhere in those weeks we'd stopped just trying to survive the night and started trying to build something that would actually last. That's the second lesson worth holding on to. The moment you stop reacting to each new crisis and start planning ahead of it, you've crossed from surviving into building. It's a quiet shift, but it changes everything about how you move through hard times. That night the fire burned steadier than it had in days, orange light moving across the wooden walls. My brother sat by the fireplace reading an old book we'd pulled from a shelf, Max asleep at his feet. Outside, the cave stayed dark and still. Inside, it was just the sound of a home slowly coming back to life. I sat back and listened, not to fear, not to hunger, just to that. And for the first time since we'd found the place, I stopped asking whether we'd survive here and started wondering how much better we could actually make it. By the second week, the cabin didn't feel abandoned anymore, but it still didn't feel like ours either. Every room still carried traces of whoever had lived there before us. Dust on every shelf, spiderwebs stretched across the corners, windows so grimy that barely any daylight got through. One morning I made a decision. If we were staying, we needed to stop acting like guests passing through and start treating the place like it belonged to us. So we did exactly that. My brother took charge of what he called cleaning, which mostly meant narrating everything to Max while waving a broom around the room, but somehow the cabin started transforming anyway. We opened every window, hauled broken furniture outside, swept out years of dust. Slowly, sunlight reached corners of that cabin that probably hadn't seen it in a decade. The biggest change happened in the main room. It had looked dim and forgotten at first, but after a few days of work it turned into the warmest spot in the whole place. The fire glowed every evening, the chairs got repaired, and the old wooden table stood proudly in the center again like it had never stopped belonging there. One afternoon, while cleaning near the back wall, my brother called me over. Behind an old cabinet, buried under a thick layer of dust, was a small wooden door I'd never noticed. We pulled the cabinet aside and the door creaked open into a narrow storage room. Most of the shelves were empty, but not all of them. Inside we found real tools: a hammer, a handsaw, a box of nails, a sharpening stone, coils of rope. To anyone passing through it would have looked like junk. To us it looked like everything. Those tools changed the pace of things completely. Now we could fix things the right way, reinforce weak boards, patch the roof, build actual shelving instead of just living around the cabin's problems. Every day after that felt like it added something real. Even Max seemed to sense it, claiming a permanent spot by the fire like he'd personally decided to guard the whole place. One evening, after a long day of repairs, I stepped out onto the porch. The cave was quiet, the forest beyond the entrance glowing faintly in the last light of sunset. I stood there and looked back at the cabin. It wasn't perfect. The paint was faded, the roof still needed work, and there was a long list of problems left to solve. But compared to the night we'd first found it, it looked like an entirely different place. That's when it hit me. We hadn't just been repairing the cabin had been repairing us right back. Every board we fixed, every room we cleared out, every problem we actually solved gave us something we hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. And that feeling turned out to be worth more than everything we'd lost getting there. Life slowly settled into something like a rhythm. Every morning I collected water from the spring. My brother handled things around the cabin, and Max followed us everywhere, making sure neither of us was ever really alone. The fear that had trailed us for so long started to fade, replaced by something steadier: routine. We planted a small garden near the cave entrance where sunlight reached the ground for a few hours a day. Nothing ambitious, just a handful of vegetables. But watching something grow again reminded us that not everything in life has to be about staying alive. Some of it gets to be about what comes next. My brother changed the most out of all of us. When we first arrived, he barely spoke. Now I heard him singing while he worked, laughing while he played with Max outside the cabin, and every time I heard it, something in me loosened a little. One evening we sat together by the fire. The garden was coming up. The wood pile was full. The cabin was warm. For the first time since we'd lost everything, we weren't thinking about what was gone. We were thinking about what we were building, and somehow that felt even better than getting our old life back. One rainy afternoon, digging through the storage room again, my brother found something wedged behind a loose board, a small dust-covered box. We carried it to the table and opened it together. Inside were a few old photographs, a worn leather journal, and something that stopped us both cold: a small carved wooden figure of a husky. The resemblance to Max was almost impossible to explain. Same ears, same posture, even the same calm look in its eyes. My brother set the figure down next to Max, and for a moment it genuinely looked like the two of them were studying each other. That night I started reading the journal. Page after page told the story of the man who'd built the cabin. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't anyone notable. He was just someone who wanted somewhere safe, far from the noise of everything else. A place where the people he cared about would always have shelter no matter what happened to him. One line stayed with me longer than the rest: if someone finds this place one day, I hope it gives them what it gave me. I read it twice, then a third time, and the room went quiet, because suddenly the whole cabin made sense. The spring positioned exactly where it was, the fireplace, the storage room stocked with tools. None of it was luck. Someone had built this with care, not just for himself, but for whoever might need it after he was gone. I looked around the room at my brother, at Max curled by the fire, at the cabin that had kept us alive, and for the first time it didn't feel like we were living in a stranger's house. It felt like we were carrying forward something he'd started without ever meeting us. Months later, that cabin looked like a completely different place. The windows were clear. The garden was thriving. Neat stacks of firewood lined the porch, and every room felt warm in a way it hadn't when we arrived. Anyone who saw it now would never guess what it looked like the night we found it. But the biggest change wasn't the cabin at all. It was us. My brother didn't flinch at every sound anymore. His laughter filled the place most days. Max had become the self-appointed guard of the entire cave, patrolling like it was his job. And me, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't lying awake wondering where we'd sleep the next night. One morning, sunlight came through the roots above the cave and scattered gold across the floor. I stood on the porch, looking out at the same forest that had once felt endless and cold. The same forest where I thought we'd lost everything. And somehow it had led us here, to a place no map would ever show, built by a stranger whose kindness reached further than his own lifetime ever could. I still keep his journal on the shelf by the fireplace. Every so often I read that same line again. If someone finds this place one day, I hope it gives them what it gave me. He never knew our names. He never met either of us. But he was right. That cabin protected us, and in its own way it handed us a second chance. Because sometimes when life strips everything away, it also puts you in the path of something you didn't know you needed. A new start, somewhere safe, a place worth calling home. If there's one thing worth carrying out of a story like this, it's that shelter was never the point. What we did with it was, anyone can find four walls, building something that actually holds up, that takes water, food, warmth, purpose, and a little bit of patience, in that order.